This is episode 1 of Innovating Education, featuring Celina de Sola, co-founder of Glasswing International. Celina de Sola was born in El Salvador, but during the Civil War in the 1980s, her family fled, first to Guatemala and then later on to the United States. Her parents raised her with a strong social conscience, which rapidly transformed into a passion for community service. She became a humanitarian aid worker in 1999. She worked for big aid organizations all around the world, in war zone and natural disaster sites. But she's also a system thinker. It frustrated her that the humanitarian aid industry was so top-down. Celina started thinking a lot about the aid model and how many resources didn't really reach communities. She headed back to El Salvador in 2007. Together with Ken Baker, a future husband, they started volunteering in public school and teaching after-school courses. They recognized that public schools were a deeply neglected asset in poor communities. They began to treat schools at the center of community, providing anything and everything that kids and their family needed with a trauma-informed lens. The non-profit organization Glasswing International was born. It is an innovative non-profit whose mission is to address the root causes of poverty and violence through education, health, and community empowerment. It brings together government, businesses, and communities to break the cycle of poverty and violence. Glasswing provides volunteer-led learning opportunities that develop kids' confidence and capabilities, keeping them away from violence and helping them to become the best version of themselves. Glasswing is impacting more than 1 million lives, with over 550 schools infrastructures improved and 1,000 after-school programs in 9 countries. Celina de Sola has been recognized by several notable organizations, including the Tallberg Foundation in 2016, the Ashoka Foundation in 2015, and the Lego Foundation in 2015. In 2018, she was selected to join the inaugural Obama Foundation Fellowship class. Her work has been featured on several notable media, including CNN and HuffPost Live. Find out more about Glasswing International by looking at their website, glasswing.org, on Facebook @GlasswingI, on Instagram @GlasswingI, and Twitter account @GlasswingInt. Welcome to this new episode of Innovating Education, and truly we are very, very, very happy to have you and to have the opportunity to listen to your story, your incredible story, to your incredible mission and the work that you are doing with your team. So welcome to the show. This is your time, this is your space, and thank you very much for being here. We're very happy to have you here with us.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Steve. I'm honored that you would think of me, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
So my first question for you would be, Celina, what is your first school memory?
Wow, my first school memory. I remember preschool. I remember being in a show where I had to sing and dance when I was a child, actually living in Guatemala, because we had to leave El Salvador during the Civil War. But I remember being in a show where we had to perform, and we were on stage doing simple drawings and then dancing.
So already creative and already contributing. You mentioned leaving El Salvador because of the war. How was that experience for you growing up? And how did it shape you into the person that you are?
You know, as a child, my parents were really, they were very good at, I don't remember as a child understanding that much when I was a small child about what was going on. It was different. I was born, it was different for me than most people who forcefully migrate under very extreme conditions, right, that we now work with. But I was raised with, economic opportunity and, this certain comforts. So I was born into a situation of a lot of privilege, which for me has turned into also a lot of the drive why I do this, because I had a very different experience of leaving the country during war. And I had access to safety, to security, to food and shelter. But I became quickly aware as a child in primary school that was not the norm. And since I was very, very little, even though I didn't have the term for social justice in my head or in my vocabulary, I always had like a sense and a kind of a discomfort, a very deep sense of perceiving the unfairness that existed around me. So I would see other children, very small children like me, and always think about why they were living in such different conditions. So for me, the experience didn't impact me directly like it impacted, and it impacts millions of people around the world because of the access to opportunities and safety net that I had. But I was seeing it around me and feeling like I had to do something, that it wasn't fair, and that kind of started a fire in my belly at a very young age to think about what things could change, what needed to change, and what my role was in trying to help that change occur. Right? Obviously not alone, but I did start thinking about this very, very young.
Is there a particular moment or story that comes to your mind and you were like, okay, this is kind of like the shift. I need to do something about that?
I had a lot of different moments. I think, for example, when I would just visually growing up in El Salvador, then Guatemala, and just visually seeing children my age on the street and feeling that sense of frustration. But I think I remember being in my grandmother's house, and one of the ladies that worked in her house, she was young, but I thought she was mom age, right? Because I was so little. But I remember I would always kind of hang out with her, and we were washing, and she was teaching me how to wash clothing with this big ball of soap, which is what we use here when you hand wash. And so we were washing in the back, and I remember asking her and talking to her about her child, and she had a little daughter that was the same age as me, and so being able to hear from her perspective, and again, I was really probably, I don't know, maybe like 8 or 9, but her telling me where she lived, and it wasn't, it was a really natural conversation, but it gave me the opportunity to talk to someone that I knew and hear what her life was like, what her life, how she had to be away from her child to work, even though she had a job, she just, there are all these factors that had nothing to do with the quality of person she was or the skill set or anything or the ambition, but the circumstance, right? So for me, it was like, it clicked for me. And I'm like, this is so arbitrary. Why am I in this situation? And her daughter, who's my age, is in such a different situation. So it clicked for me that conditions of poverty, of extreme adversity and violence, I was like, why? It's so arbitrary and it's so unjust, because it's a context, right, that you're born into, you're dealt a set of cards, and subsequently you get or you don't get opportunities. But so much of it is ecological, right? It's about what's happening around you. So again, I probably didn't articulate it that way, but I remember thinking how arbitrary and how unfair, and that can't be okay, and then that kind of grew from there into a big fire in the belly. And I think just a constant desire to, it's not, for me, it's like almost never enough. There's so much more to do. And I admire so many people that work on so many of these issues.
What were the challenges at that time for the youth and your country?
Okay, sure. So I just want to put in quickly that I actually started volunteering when I was 12. So I think when I was 12 years old, I started to understand that there were things you could do, even if they seemed really tiny. There were things you could do to learn more and to try to provide support in some way. So volunteering for me was really important in helping me develop a sense of agency and start to address the helplessness that I think you feel when you feel like the problems are way bigger than what you can solve, right? So volunteering was a tool to feel like, okay, there is something I can do. I can't do it all at once, but I can do something. So that kind of was my second click at 12. And then, of course, fast forward.
No. Wait.
Yeah.
Sorry. I'm sorry. Because I know some parents are listening to us. So I'm a father. I have a 13 years old boy. And
Okay.
how do you start volunteering at 12? Like, is it something that came from your parents? Like, what's the story behind that?
It's funny. So I have a 9-year-old boy too. And, I was just reading an incredible quote that I will find for you because it's really beautiful. But I was just, I think that, yes, in part, my mother, whenever I would tell my mother, Mommy, I feel so guilty. Look, I feel so guilty. Why do I live like this? And why does someone else, why is that child selling candy or nuts on the street? Why are they barefoot? And interestingly enough, my child at 6 or 5 or 6 said the same thing. He looked outside the car. We were living in El Salvador, and he said to me, Mommy, where is his mom? And a little boy that was trying to sell me something at the window. And I think it's a very delicate balance between saying to someone, oh, his mom is exploiting him and putting on the street. No, right? I said, his mom loves him very much, and his mom is probably close by also working. So I think it's really important to really always base everything on human dignity. And when we explain to kids, and like I try to do with my son, like, mom has to work, and he's like, well, why does he have to sell candies too? Why isn't he in school or at home? And explain and say, listen, there's some people who, even though they work so hard, they're not paid enough, they don't get enough income, essentially, right? They don't make enough money to buy the food they need to feed the family. So sometimes children have to help their parents, and it's unjust. It's not fair. So explain it in a way that is always dignified for the person you're talking about, right? And doesn't demonize anybody for, which for me, I think has been important. And I've been learning with a child how to talk about this in a way that, because if not, you create this otherness, right? People in poverty or people not in poverty. So for me, it's really underscoring that circumstance. And I think I was raised like that. I don't remember it explicitly, but I think for somehow my siblings also, like, we always knew that the situation, people, respect and dignity are important aside from kindness, right? But it's understanding that context, that there is this unfairness and there is this randomness about, and it's arbitrary, and you're born into situations of privilege or of adversity, or sometimes both in a lifetime. But I think for kids and for parents to try to communicate to kids that we do need to contribute to figuring this, to more equitable conditions to access. So I started volunteering because I think I was raised that way. So I always had that kind of fire that we need to do something about it. Don't feel guilty, because guilt is paralyzing. And by the way, I always work with guilt. I'm always feeling guilty. And this is a lifelong battle, really, all the time. So I can't say that I'm a work in progress. I think, like we all are. But I think for kids who do have access to opportunities, to feel guilty. So if you approach it like, oh, you have to give to the poor, or, oh, you have so much other people don't, I think that can be very paralyzing, because you feel guilt and you feel shame. Whereas if you approach it as, that kid probably likes playing what you like to play, right? There's so many things in common, and volunteering gives a kid and the parent and a child gives you the opportunity to do things together. So, for example, if we go volunteer, we have a lot of volunteering at Glasswing, but I've been taking my son since he was a baby, because for me, he'll play with, like, kids play with other kids. So it's so much easier when they're little, because they don't think about all these things the same way we do with kind of more guilt or judgment, or kids will play with kids. And so I started volunteering at 12 because I had that desire to do something about it, and to harness the opportunities I had had, or the access I had had, to do something to make it, to provide opportunities for other people. and at 12, I was volunteering with the Special Olympics, or I was volunteering with, at the time, we'd go to hospitals and they were like preemies and they needed, you would just talk to babies. So there were different activities, but there was something really rewarding about it. And I think kids are naturally, I think kids can be really empathetic and they feel really good about volunteering. So they're very pure of heart. So, I think that's a great age to just bring them without making it a guilt thing and saying, we have more, let's give to those who don't know. It's like, come with me, let's go do something really fun. Like, we're going to go hang out with these kids, or we're going to go fix this school, or, whatever it is. Like, if you take them over Christmas, I'm like, I don't want to just like have this concept of the haves and have-nots. I want, we went to a hospital, we decorated the hospital with holiday decor. And then for moms who had had babies in the hospital, we brought them a kit for the baby, but it's like any mom. We didn't talk about whether they were living in conditions of poverty or not. We just said, oh no, or kids who had been injured during the holidays. I was like, think about, let's get what you would want if you were stuck in the hospital with an injury. So if you had a broken arm over Christmas time and you were stuck in the hospital, what would you want someone to bring you? So that's kind of that's the framework I use. Like, it's a bummer they're in the hospital at Christmas. I don't say, oh my gosh, they're in this public hospital that has barely any medicine and da da da. No, I try to go from a place of that dignity and of agency and of empathy. Like, we really, there's a lot of commonality.
And I think this is key, actually, when you're mentioning that notion of dignity, right? So, for example, not to define these human beings just in material terms, right? So they may be with less economical resources, but they're still human beings. And I particularly love the point that you make about kind of making that link and that connection and finding the thing in common, and also that togetherness that you mentioned. Okay, what do we have in common? Okay, look at this person as a human being with its dignity.
Right.
She's not defined by that materialistic or that economical situation. There's more to that person, and I really enjoy that.
Well, the thing is, and you think about it, and now, just contextualizing it in general with working in education, if you constantly think of someone, and here in Latin America, they say, ay, ayudar a los pobres, and you say like the poor, that can have messaging that says, the poor can have messaging that says, okay, that can be interpreted as, they're not going to be able to thrive the same way. They don't have the same human potential, which is never the case. So I think it's just that characterizing of the poor, the wealthy, is just a strange and inaccurate way to talk about people, right? And we all know that there are different kinds of richness in life, and so I think that just characterizing, using the word poor as opposed to living in conditions of, which it takes a lot more words and characters. But you know what I mean? It's a very important distinction that I think
And and I know that poverty can appear in so many ways. One of my favorite book growing up was Mother Teresa, her biography, and actually she speaks about the poverty, like kind of like that spiritual poverty, and people being alone, even having a lot of materialistic or economical resources, but still being alone, not having someone to talk, etc. So even here, or even in better condition, there are so many type of poverties. And also one thing that I find interesting in that book, and that resonate with what you are saying, she was talking about that you should always have in your circle some people that have not the same economical resource, right? So that's something that when you say you take your kids, you're 9 years old, with you, that's something that resonates with me, that aspect of actually exposing and being connected to these other realities.
And making it fun. It's actually fun.
Yes.
Right? Like, volunteering is fun.
Yes.
It's not to have to go give things out. No, it's to connect, and it's to build empathy, and it's to understand how similar we are, and that And if we do understand and we see the difference, we understand that the difference isn't attributed or anybody's fault. It's not attributed to the person, it's the context.
I don't know if I told you, I used to live in Nicaragua.
Ah,
Por eso
okay.
hablo castellano. En
Ay, qué
parte.
bueno.
Sí, y
You
en
were working
España.
in Nicaragua?
See, I did my internship there, and I spent 6
Excellent.
months, and I really enjoyed Central America and the people, amazing people. Yes, one of the
Great.
most beautiful experience in my life. So I have a special,
Oh, I'm so glad.
special link with the region.
Where did you work?
So I was doing my internship at the time at UNICEF, but I was based in Puerto Cabezas, which is in northern Caribbean part. So I wasn't in Managua. I was out there on the field.
Right.
And
no, you were in the very an area that's very underdeveloped.
yes, economically. Yeah.
Yes.
But beautiful people,
Yes.
a lot of challenges. I think kind of the challenges that you're facing with violence and
yes.
and discrimination, Afro-Caribbean communities, and but so much hope, so much potential, so many beautiful stories. I had a great time there. Tell us more about how was the situation with, particularly my understanding, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is you started with the children. You must have observed something at the time. What was the situation?
You know, it's interesting. So I was working with he wasn't my husband, but at the time we were working at another nonprofit doing disaster relief humanitarian aid. So my job was to work in complex humanitarian contexts. So I worked in Iraq, in Afghanistan, I worked in Liberia, I worked in Sudan and Chad. So we were working all over the world. And it came to a point where, I think both of us decided that we wanted to move away from the humanitarian aid sector and move into development. And the violence was really on the rise here, getting to pretty extreme levels. The youth violence, the problem with the gangs. And of course, I was working in context of violence, but they were different. They were very different contexts of violence. There was no open conflict per se in Central America. There were no civil wars anymore, but there was this kind of this community level violence, extortion, homicides, feminicides. So we wanted to come back and work here, understanding. We knew, having worked in conflict zones and I had been really interested my whole life. I've been very interested in trauma and mental health. And I knew that, from the reading I had done about it, again, this is a long time ago, almost 20 years ago, but I understood that if someone is perpetuating violence, it's because they had been victims at some point, that you're not born thinking that you want to, be an aggressor. So there's a lot more science around that now, but we wanted to come here because we knew that the reason kids were getting involved in the gangs, the reason the violence was escalating, had a lot more to do with a lack of opportunity and trauma than it did with, with just being bad kids, right? Like, it's not there's this like, oh, kids in gangs or young people in gangs and they're all criminals. And it was a lot more complicated. So we moved here and I was working on a maternal health project for another organization. There's a very high rate of teen pregnancy, adolescent pregnancy here. So I was working on a project but slowly we started Glasswing. And the way we started, we didn't think, let's start another organization. We just said, let's go work in, I'm from El Salvador. My brother is Salvadoreño. Let's work in the country that we're from. And my brother's in business. He doesn't work in the organization in the day-to-day. But we came and we started volunteering. Glasswing started as just a volunteer group. We started volunteering in the public school that had a reputation to be very high risk, and that the kids, there were different gangs recruiting kids from that school. So it was actually a pretty tough place to start. but we started in that school because of the stigma precisely, and literally it was about spending. The schools have 2 shifts, so some kids go in the morning, some kids go in the afternoon, but kids only had 4 hours a day of schooling, and in the middle of the day the schools were empty. So we're like, why don't we run programs? Let's keep the school open in the middle of the day, and we run programs that kids can sign up for. English club, writing club. We started girls clubs. We started with just a few, and what we saw that there was a huge desire and demand for these kinds of opportunities, and not just learning, but just having that mentorship, like someone who cares enough about your well-being to show up every week consistently, right? So we started empirically. Again, this wasn't like, ooh, let's start Glasswing, and no, this is very empirical. It was very organic growth, and we just started seeing this opportunity. And then simultaneously, we started work. Companies would ask, people who worked in companies were like, oh, about nonprofits, can you help us do volunteering? And historically, they would do, they would go to an orphanage, play with kids, and give them toys. And that can actually be really harmful to kids, and with the best intentions, but you can't just show up once in an orphanage and leave and kind of have a moment of bonding with children who have been, have been abandoned already. So even though people do that with the best intentions, so we tried to shift, simultaneously do our own volunteering. And then when we did work, we saw this opportunity to help companies think about volunteering, and people think about volunteering more as a value generator and not as a charitable act. So we started trying to, also expose people in society, different sectors. So we saw that corporates, employees hadn't necessarily seen what the conditions were in public schools. So we would run these volunteer programs in public schools and in different communities. And when we volunteered, so did the students, so did the teachers, so did the parents. So it was this kind of really interesting way to build social cohesion, right? It was like, let's team up and let's fix this school. And let's fix this kindergarten. So we'd have like these mornings of like 4 hours of 200 volunteers and fix something. We wouldn't just play, we would fix something together. And oftentimes the community parent might be a really good carpenter, and they would be teaching the CEO or, the head of marketing. So you had this really great kind of flip of power dynamics, that the whole process, even though the end result was very clear, during the process, you were building bridges, right, across so many different sectors and people. And we saw little by little that there was an opportunity to actually set up a social enterprise, right, set up a nonprofit organization that would address some of the challenges that we were seeing of violence, of poverty, lack of opportunity, the trauma, but at the same time, make sure that all sectors were engaged. And also, really a lot of times we just kind of say, oh, it's the government's job to have good healthcare. It's the government's job to have good education. But the government sector, education sectors and health sectors are a lot of times underfunded. So for us, it was really important to always work within the public systems, because you have infrastructure, you have people, you have the convening power. So we're like, let's work within public systems and build on that instead of creating something parallel. So, and let's get other sectors involved, meaning business sector, meaning civil society. So for us, it became this interesting model of saying, we want to address the root causes. We want to understand, we want to understand better from the students what their challenges are, and from the families. We want to help respond to those and address those at the root. And at the same time, make sure we integrate public, private, and civil society sectors. Like, how can we do this together as a broader society, a broader community? And so I think that we saw these opportunities, and that led us into then developing different models of intervention and different programs that are now have been scaled, right? We work in 10 countries now. So, but it really was organic, and it was learning, and it was, a lot of it was like, go with your gut. Like, what is it? What do you feel, and listening to communities, listening to kids, and understanding what they felt their priorities were, not what I thought or Ken or our volunteers thought the priorities were.
As you were talking, I took many notes. I got even more questions. What was your biggest discovery or your surprise or some belief that you may have had? And by listening to these communities, you found out something.
There have been many things. This wasn't my first, but this was really recent. And I think this is so important because you always have to keep asking because you're always going to keep learning. Even if we've been asking for 13 years, we still don't know because things change and you just have to ask constantly and get these feedback loops with the populations you work with, whether they're children, adolescents, adults. And interestingly, so we started doing this. We have after school programs. So we have this program called community schools that what we do is we convert public schools into centers of community and we work with teachers. We build on the local strengths and resources of the schools and we have after school programming, restorative practices, at the after school program, we have competitions between schools, but really it's kind of this sense of using the school as a center of community as opposed to just a school. And so we've been evaluating these programs for a long time. And recently we decided, we said, why don't we look at character strengths more explicitly, even though all of our programs have been designed, they're trauma informed, they've been designed to develop life skills, but we didn't explicitly talk about character strengths in the programs. It was implicit, it was implied. And so we said, why don't we look at character strengths? And so we had this list, this researcher, his name is Seligman, came up, he has this, you can look it up, I actually really recommend it. It's called the VIA character survey, and you can do it, anybody can do it online. It's great. And it's in many languages. But so we have a list of character strengths. It's all strengths-based that we came up with. And we gave it to the students. And we, of course, had in our head the character strengths that we thought, right, would be ideal. This is after a lot of research and work. And one of the things that came up that we wouldn't have picked as the top 4, because say we had to pick 4, I think we had to pick 4 or 5. And we had like the ones that we thought and that were the evidence-based and da-da-da. And interestingly, one of the character strengths that came up as one of their top priorities that they wanted to develop was hope. Hope. Isn't that? Yeah. And you said it, when we were talking earlier. And what's interesting to me is, like, first of all, would you even characterize hope as a character? If I said to you, what are 5 character strengths? Would you have mentioned hope, right? Would I have mentioned hope? And then, of course, once they said it, you're like, of course, right? Of course. But interestingly, when you think about it, you're like, okay, communications and resilience and empathy, and you have all these other things in your head as a practitioner, as a development person, as a whatever, a child, an educator, and yet they picked hope. They wanted hope more than a lot of other things. So for us, first of all, it reinforced the absolute importance of always asking. Of course, we included it because, but it was really a lot of others we did overlap on. But hope, they want to build hope and maintain hope, and hope is so important for aspirational thinking, for futures thinking. So again, in hindsight, you're like, oh, but we didn't write it down. We didn't pick it. It wasn't on the top of our radar from a huge list. So for me, that's been a recent aha moment. That is a really important reminder, and it was deep. It was like, whoa, like it knocks the wind out, because you're like, oh, you feel so silly for not having thought of it. But at the same time, you're going with what you assume. And that's something, and it also made me sad, right? Like that's something so, it makes you sad because that's something that's so fundamental in how you exist and and it's so important for thriving to have hope. So it broke my heart, and at the same time, it was like, of course, so anyway, that being said, a year later, that is a core part of the explicit character strengths we now work on.
Hope and imagination are the biggest
Mm-hmm.
challenges that we have right now. And I think being an educator
Absolutely.
is like engineering hope, you know?
Absolutely.
It's so deep what these kids said to you. I think they got it. You know, it's not about, it's
deep.
very deep. How do you engineer hope? How do you design education for hope? And I'm asking you that question. So,
oh my gosh, that's like $1 million question. You know what's so interesting, and I wish I could answer it. I don't have the answer for you, because I think you can engineer imagination more easily in many cases than you can engineer, and that's very difficult. I agree with you. I think creativity, curiosity. I do think that engineering imagination helps to engineer hope. I think if you can imagine something, it does feed hope. I think and Ken, my husband, always says, this is about giving kids hope and knowing that, that there's someone who believes in them. And I think having people that believe in you, especially, I think definitely your inner circle, which in many cases may or may not happen on any socioeconomic level, like your family but if someone who's totally outside your day to day believes in you that much, and that's where volunteering is so important, or teachers. Oh my gosh, teachers are so important. And I'll tell you a story about, I think, one of my teachers. But I think if you engineer imagination, if you can, and also play, I think is really important for hope and for imagination, because play, when kids have trauma, and many of you know this, I'm sure in the audience, you cannot expect kids to do math and learn math if they are in survival mode. So if kids are in survival mode, and there's all the neuroscience around this, right, around the trauma and cortisol and all these things, it's very difficult to perform in school. So that perpetuates kind of these negative cycles where you think you're a failure, your self-esteem is, your confidence. But it's something that we're not understanding, that as systems, that we need to take into account, that your mindset needs to be in the right place to be able to learn, and play helps you do that. So interestingly, when we've evaluated the after school programs, which are play based, they're fun, they're recreational, there's that component of putting your head in a space of calm, and there aren't these tough expectations. And I think you've probably heard of Carol Dweck about growth
and fixed
mindset,
mindset,
right?
yes.
So I think the combination of, right, like putting kids into a space of calm and play, and not yet, like we will get there. And then also having someone that believes in you. And I'm always like, you almost like hold up a mirror to a kid so they can see what you see in them. Like, you can't assume that they understand their own potential. So if you reiterate and you say, I see this in you, I see so much potential in you. So I think those are really important, very important to contributing to hope, saying, I believe in you. And so you almost like tell them so much that they almost fake it till they make it. They'll have, if they're hearing it constantly, like I tell my son all the time, and he's like, I'm like, no, but I admire the way you do this. And I think that accompaniment of a role model, of an adult figure, that can complement other role models they have in their personal lives, but someone who spends that time with you because they want to be there, not because they're paid, no, because they want to be there with you, is very powerful for hope. And then if they start seeing things change, so if all of a sudden they were getting, one of the teachers told me in one of the schools that we work in, she's like, we had kids that were getting 4 out of 10, and now they're getting a 6 out of 10. It's awesome. Like, I don't need them to get an 8 out of 10. I just need them to know that they can improve, because I know that that'll put them in that direction of aspiration. So it's having expectations that are, you've got to meet kids where they're at. And I think you as an educator know that very well, more than I do. I'm not an educator, but I do. I think we have to engineer hope, or at least provide the context and build ecosystems around and scaffolding around students. And I use the word scaffolding because you build scaffolding, but also the person climbing it builds it as they go up. So you build like a base of scaffolding, but then as you go up, you have to add more layers. So the person that's climbing is also building. And I think that concept of ecosystems around kids, communities that support kids so they can support their own development and growth is what we have to crack that nut. We have to figure out what ingredients we need to do that. And I think we're all on that learning journey
It never
together.
ends. It never ends. And one of the things, and you actually jump into it, that I found quite inspiring and an incredible example about what you do is the way you are actually able to work in a holistic way and systemic way. So your approach goes from not just the education, but the mental health. And you mentioned also the teachers training, and you mentioned the community. And how important is that approach? And how did you figure that out along the way, or is it something that you built step by step? Can you tell us more about that?
I think everything happens, at least for us, we've learned along the way. We do a lot of, I'm really lucky to have amazing colleagues. And I think not just directly like my colleagues at Glasswing, but also volunteers, teachers, everybody we've worked with in the health sector. And I think as we've been trying to address priorities and the more questions we ask, we've made a lot of mistakes. And I think we've been learning, but we have been for a while really thinking. I think when we developed this idea, and there are other organizations that also work in schools, and we just felt like, the more, I think there's like a lot of times a push for huge scale, massive scale of solutions. And there's some things that, yes, you can copy, paste, and scale, right? Or if you're selling a product, you can scale the sale of a product that has impact. And, but when we're talking about social cohesion, when we're talking about issues of violence, issues of trauma, it's about healing, and healing is about deep impact. It's about deep scale. So the more we learn from the communities and the kids we work with, and the more we learn from the science and the research around the world, healing is about community, and healing is about all of these different actors, not just what seems to be the obvious. Like, you don't just, if someone, right now, I think everybody can relate to that because we're so isolated because of COVID. So all of a sudden, everybody's understanding what it feels like to feel isolated, and right, we're forced to be isolated, and it makes it harder. And so a lot of people are feeling that anxiety and the loneliness. But that's something that a lot of times is felt by communities who, obviously communities and conditions of adversity are disproportionately affected by any crisis, whether it's war or whether it's tropical storms or earthquakes. But I think that I know we've been learning along the way, and we've seen that the bigger we can build the ecosystem around, and even you can think of it as level of one child, of one little girl, little boy, and then you kind of build these circles out, and you have like the immediate circle, the circle, and you could keep building those out. But the bigger we make these communities around each child, around each school, all of a sudden it's almost like this, you start identifying this amazing referral network of resources within communities, or if it doesn't exist, how do you then link that kind of set of circles to another community? And you start identifying how you can, take these like strengths-based approaches and identify resources and communities. And when they aren't there, how do we build them there? So I think for us, we've always been really committed to strengths-based work, to locally driven interventions and programming, and very participative programming, So I think it's almost been kind of empirical in what we do, but we've been learning along the way a lot and really looking at what works. And we constantly adapt from models we see from Big Brother, Big Sister, from Harlem Children's Zone, from models in the Friendship Bench, in Zimbabwe. There's so many models that were inspired by communities and schools, citizen schools. There's so many, but I think, yes, it's a lot of it has been learning and combining our empirical learning with research and a constant feedback loop with kids and communities to make sure that we're all involved, and that it makes sense to everybody, primarily those that are the kids that we're hoping to provide the support.
Can you tell us more about the power of that journey, the power of the process? Because a lot of time we think about, okay, the deliverable and the goal and scaling, as you say. But I think there's something very important that can be said about that process.
Yeah, I mean, for us, the journey is so important, because it is a process, and in that process, there's a lot of inflection points, and to be honest, you can think you arrived at the destination, but things change. The context is so fluid that it is a constant journey. Things are changing so much. I mean, who would have thought that we'd have this global pandemic? Everybody had plans to do, for this year. Everybody had plans, whether they were with their business or with their community or with their church or whatever. So I think that flexibility, I think there's a quote I love. I was trying to find it, by Lao Tzu, but and he says, like, he refers to the bamboo as a very, you have to be flexible enough that you can take, strength comes from flexibility and from learning and from being adaptable in the journey. Resilience is about that. So I think for an organization, like individuals, we have to always be on that journey, because if not, it's obsolete. Not just because of a pandemic, but also technology. Everything's changing. And so the journey, it is a permanent journey, really. And a permanent learning curve.
Before you mentioned how you work with the public system, what was the key for you to be actually able to bring innovation and to bring them as partners of the innovation?
I just think there's no other way. And going back to the conversation about scale and reaching more kids, if you want to reach more people, first of all, the government serves the biggest part of the population. Whether you agree with who's elected or not is not that relevant when you realize it is relevant to so many things, of course, human rights violation, all kind of things. But when you really think about wanting to reach the greatest number of people and reaching those that maybe no one else can reach, the government has a national presence. For better or worse, they have a national presence. So a clinic, a school, they're geographically positioned to try to reach the entire population. That, and also it's an existing infrastructure and system. So when you work within a system and you design implementation and implement programs that work, because a government can't innovate, right? A government can't afford to take the risk of innovating. Say there's this perfect government that really is there. They're really about civil service, right? In an ideal world. And they really want to do right by everybody. But to innovate for a government is very challenging. It's risking resources. It's risking public resources. Whereas we, in the civil society sector and in the private sector, we can be the ones to innovate. And if we innovate within the system, then we're giving tools. We're saying, look, it works in your own system. So you're developing models, co-developing, co-designing with communities, with kids, models that they can then adopt once they've been proven. So I think once they've been proven to work, it's a very unique and I think a very important relationship to have civil society and can be the ones to innovate. So then you can affect policy that way, because I can't come if I had a private school for children from areas that face adversity. That would be great. I can have an enormous amount of impact, and a lot of organizations do. The tough thing is, how do you justify to a government you should do this everywhere when it's not within that system, right? When you have all these other costs, it's not feasible financially for them to scale something that's done completely within the private sector, because it implies a lot more cost, a different structure, different leadership. So for us, it's very important, and I think we're doing a disservice if we're not trying to identify ways that public service can be improved and strengthened. I think globally education needs to change. Finland and some of the Scandinavian countries have totally transformed the way kids learn, the hands-on learning, the student-centered learning. we're all stuck in like the Industrial Revolution, right? That we're training people, so we're not preparing them for this changing future. And the best way I believe, and I think a lot of my colleagues, we've talked about this in our team, that the best way we can contribute to ensuring kids are better prepared for quickly changing contexts is to work on life skills development. And if we can, to work on these kind of social and emotional competencies. So if we can find ways to do it within the public system that are not cost prohibitive, that really leverage their existing resources, that way we can impact more people. And that's our goal, to reach more people, whether we're doing it or someone else is doing it, doesn't really matter to us, as long as more kids can access these things. Because at the end of the day, no one really makes something up when it comes to approaches. It's always adapting other approaches and learning from other people. So, it's not like we can take credit for any specific model. It's just pulling from other people's experiences and ideas and responding to what people are asking for and what their priorities are.
The trauma and the restorative process and health, that is something that is at the core of your approach in a holistic way. Healing,
right.
Healing is the key word, that
Yes.
Trauma and healing. And this is so important. I would like to dig a little bit more into that.
Yeah, it really is. And I think, I'll give you a statistic. I think it's from the WHO, but, I think someone who has been a victim of violence is 5 times more likely to perpetuate that violence. And so I think it's really important to understand that when we're talking about victim versus perpetrator, and in a context like this, so just to give you another statistic, this is a World Bank statistic from 2018, I think. So Latin America has 8% of the world's population and 37% of its homicides globally. So, and you know this, you lived in Nicaragua. And so we really need to talk about trauma and healing. And we need to start by really understanding that those who perpetrate violence, for the most part, have lived through violence, have survived violence, or those who have been victimized repeatedly. You're also more likely to be re-victimized if you've been victimized. So we have to understand that violence and trauma, it's almost like an infectious disease. Like it's something that you learn, and it's a behavior, and it can be changed. And I think believing that people can heal is important, and believing, and of course, I think it's much easier said than done. If you've lost your child to homicide, for someone to come talk to you about healing and forgiveness, you want to just, we'd all lose our mind, right? But I think, I think slowly we have to just understand what it is that causes these behaviors, the root causes. And if we're able to heal when people go through traumatic events, it's less likely that they'll feel a desire for revenge, or that they'll feel that. Trauma does physical things to you too, right? The emotional trauma has physical consequences: paranoia, lack of sleep, the hypervigilance. So the more we understand that, because a lot of the young people we work with, when we work in hospitals with people who come in with violent injury, and a lot of them have also perpetrated violent injury, right? So we don't ask about anything. All we say is, how are you feeling? Just so you know, this is what happened, and we're here. We want to explain what happens when, I don't know if you've ever been shot, but these are some of the things you might feel, and you normalize not the violence, but you normalize the emotions that they are feeling. Because if you don't know what trauma does, what violence does, you think you're losing your mind, or you think you're a bad person for having done something, as opposed to, I think one researcher said, don't ask what's wrong with you. You ask what happened to you. Like, what's wrong with you? Why'd you do that? So it's this lens of, if we can start developing a trauma-informed culture, a culture of healing that is restorative, that looks towards the healing and restoration as opposed to being punitive, I I think we can really change those numbers and horrible statistics that we house here and in the world. And again, it's easier said than done. But I mean, I worked in different parts of the world too. And that's why I got so interested in mental health. Because on the one hand, in conflict zones, you just, seeing child soldiers. I mean, I worked in Liberia, and you see these children, and, they're children, and they're holding a rocket propelled grenade, or they were holding, this is a long time ago, but, but then you see Liberia now, right? There is healing. Rwanda, right? I mean, there's so much intergenerational trauma. Now we know it also is genetic, like it's transferred from generation to generation. So there's so much we need to do. There's so much healing in the world. And if we start thinking about it in a more purposeful way and not stigmatizing, and having people understand that what they're feeling and going through is what happens. It is a normal response to an abnormal situation. I remember the tsunami was the last emergency I worked at. And I remember being in Banda Aceh, which was one of the hardest hit area. It was the hardest hit area in Indonesia and globally. And I remember thinking, why are we we're making this so clinical, right? Like everybody has PTSD, I'm like, and then I started like reading about it afterwards. I'm like, they're normal reactions to abnormal circumstances. And for millions, so many, I'm sure for millions of years, humans know about healing. All these traditional practices are about circles and healing. So we need to recover that and draw from the wisdom of so many, Indigenous and Native American populations that know so much more about healing than we do, and are so much more connected to the world than we are now, and would recover that and learn from that. So we're trying to build in these restorative practices and mindfulness, and really recover what has existed for so many years in so many communities. Not reinvent the wheel. Even if we have different words for things, it's still the practice that's the most important, and something that everybody can do. We don't have psychologists for every school or social workers. There aren't enough. So how do we recover that ability that we had thousands of years ago when we weren't as, quote, civilized, right? In quotes.
In quotes.
We need to really recover that and bring it forward.
Tell us a little bit more about some of the ways that you are able to bring that indigenous knowledge and spirituality into your process and your way.
We bring it in. I think on the one hand, I think people bring in at a very individual, personal level, their own spirituality. So whereas, for one person, mindfulness may be the way they connect. For someone else, it may be through their faith, through their church, through the, so I think it's very personal, but I think it's creating spaces for reflection. We are a secular organization, but it's creating that space for reflection and letting people from the inside, letting their spirituality be something that, they determine where they draw that from. And again, when we go back to talking about hope, some people draw hope from religion. Other people draw hope from other things. Like I'm a wildlife enthusiast. I love nature. I love so for me, it isn't religion per se, but for me, I'm very connected to nature and animals. So my connection is through that. Like I feel like I feed my soul if I'm in the outdoors, or if I'm with animal, seeing them, or with my pet, whatever it is. So to each person, that's very personal. So I think it's important to leave space for that pathway. Everybody can take their own pathway, but to make sure that you create the physical space and the moment in time, and the exercises give people the tools to reflect, to breathe, very practical tools, right? So it's not even like try to breathe, when you're trying to calm down, count down from, very slowly from 8 or 6, or breathing techniques, meditation techniques, and not hard ones, simple ones. And that way you're giving people kind of non-denominational tools that they can draw from and use anywhere. And then the restorative practices is amazing because the participants are the ones, and we use community cafe, like we use the World Cafe methodology too. So everyone brings forward what they want to talk about in the World Cafe and the community cafes. And then the restorative practices is a lot about listening and pausing. And again, I think restorative practices have been drawn from Asian practices. So we're constantly learning more and more about that, and making sure that people are free to pick how they, practice that, whether it's through their faith or other ways.
Hi everyone, thank you for being part of this journey. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast. I'm getting started, so you leaving me a review means a lot and it will definitely help. Make sure you join the Facebook group to continue this conversation and discover exclusive content. Subscribe to the newsletter to find out more about the episodes and the guests. You talk about caring, and I jump into love, which I believe is a huge part of what you do and your vision, and what is the importance and what is your vision about caring and love?
I think there is that is such an important, love, feeling worthy. I think when you feel loved and someone cares about you, you feel worthy. Sometimes people don't feel worthy, but if you feel that love consistently, it makes you feel more worthy and deserving. And I think when you don't feel the love and caring, you have the opposite, and that's where we have the hopelessness and that isolation that kids and individuals can feel. And caring and love, they can be on a spectrum or not, right? Of demonstrations of affection or different kinds of, but it's also kindness. Kindness is such a sometimes overly used word, but it's so deep and so important. And I think those words, kindness, caring, and love, they have such a profound impact. And I think we can all remember, and we have people in our lives that when we've had moments that have been very challenging, feeling that love, even if it's someone, if you have something happen and you tell someone about it, they don't even need to say anything, right? But feeling that love and caring and support is it's so valuable, and it helps you feel stronger, right? It gives you resilience, and it gives you that hope, and I think also enables you to be able to be that person for someone else. So it's like this really amazing cascade effect, that when you do feel that love and caring, you can then provide that for someone else more, and you feel like if you have that, it gives you the strength, is what I'm trying to say. I think it helps give you the strength and resilience to be able to do what you need to do to survive in your own life and to face adversity, but also to be able to do that for someone else. And it's such a pure feeling. And again, even if it's not, if you don't get to the point where it's love and you feel like you use that word to express how you feel about a student, for example, or one of your peers, but the caring is really strong too. So that's why I like that you use both words, because if you care deeply about other people's well-being or about other people, and then you see the way they care about you, maybe that also helps you care more about yourself. Hopefully it does, right? So it is a very, just like, violence and other things can be contagious, so is love, and so is kindness, and so is caring. So it's like, it's so cliche to say that, but it's almost like we just need to do so much more of that to overcome the others and prevent them.
I truly believe that this is the key to actually doing what you do, and having the impact that you're having, and also pass it on, like when you talk about teachers and truly by showing that you care. Sometimes it's not just about what you do, what you give. Sometimes it's how you do it. Did you do it with love? Did you care about that person?
Exactly, the intent.
Yeah, the intent. And this makes the whole. You may not be equipped with the technical skills, etc., but when you are there and caring, it makes a difference for.
Absolutely. You know, I saw this quote that I want to share that I came across recently. Ayesha Siddiqui said this, and she said, "Be the person you needed when you were younger."
Oh, wow.
I love that.
Wow.
Isn't that great?
This is beautiful.
Right? I mean, draw from it like something that's relatable. Like, what did you need when you were younger? And be that for someone. And that gives us, I think it, at least for me, it gives me really a lot to think about, because there's, what did I need?
And you jump into my last question is usually, what is your favorite quote, or what can you
really?
There we go, we got it.
Oh, good.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
You read my mind.
Yeah.
No, seriously, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Celina.
Steve, can I leave you a quote for you as a father?
Yes, go ahead.
May we raise children who love the unloved things, the dandelion, the worms, and spiderlings, children who sense the rose needs the thorn and run into rain-sweat days the same way they turn towards sun. And when they're grown and someone has to speak for those who have no voice, may they draw upon that wilder bond those days of tending tender things and be the one.
This was a beautiful gift, having you on this podcast. Through this conversation, you open us to envisioning school as a place of caring, envisioning school as a place of togetherness, as a place of healing, as you mentioned, as a place where communities can be built, also as a place where we can envision and feel the power of hope. I believe that there is something very fascinating about daring to try, even when everything seems so dark. In these times we are living, daring to believe might be the definition of courage. You are the definition of courage, Celina. Today we learned so much. Thank you for inviting us on this journey to believe in the power of transformational processes. Thank you for showing us that no one is born violent, that we are just the result of stories and environments, as you mentioned. Thank you for having the audacity to believe and the audacity of hope.